So I was going to do something different tonight. I was going to sit down with the men who built fascism. So Mussolini, Hitler, Pinochet, and ask them how they did it. Let the architects explain the playbook. And then I thought, this might not be such a good idea. Why would I give them the microphone? They had the microphone. They had the armies, they had the secret police, the propaganda ministries, and the full machinery of state. They've been heard extensively. You know who hasn't been heard enough? The people who saw it coming. The people who said, this is what's happening while it was happening. These were the people that said the emperor has no clothes and were ignored, imprisoned, or killed for it. So tonight, we're flipping the script. 3 people who oppose 3 different dictators. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian intellectual who analyzed Mussolini's fascism from inside a prison cell and wrote the book on how authoritarian power actually works. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who saw Hitler's rise, spoke out when the church went silent, joined the resistance, and was executed 3 weeks before the war ended. And Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile, who was overthrown by Pinochet's CIA-backed coup and died in the presidential palace rather than surrender the office people gave him. These are AI-generated personas, not seances. They're analytical reconstructions built on the historical record. The machine is generating their responses live, in character, unscripted. I'm not asking them to tell us what fascism looks like from the dictator's chair. I'm asking them what it looks like from the other side when you can see it coming. You're shouting warnings and nobody's listening because that feels a lot more relevant right now. Welcome to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. I'm Analog Scott. Tonight, the machine is channeling 3 people who fought authoritarianism and lost, at least in their lifetimes. But their analysis, their courage, and their warnings outlasted every regime that tried to silence them. Quick ground rules: these personas are built to be analytically honest. They'll tell you what they saw, they'll tell you what they missed, they'll draw parallels to what's happening in the United States when I ask them to, and they won't be gentle about it. So this is podcast mode. The people who fought fascism didn't mince words, and neither will we. Let's get into it. Signor Gramsci, you spent 11 years in Mussolini's prisons. The prosecutor at your trial said, and this is a direct quote, "We must stop this brain from working for 20 years. They gave you 20. You died after 11, but in those 11 years, you wrote 33 notebooks, the prison notebooks, and they became one of the most important analyses of power and fascism ever produced." So here's my first question. You watched Mussolini take a democracy and turn it into a dictatorship in real time. What was the sequence? How did it actually work? Not the textbook version, the version you saw with your own eyes.
It was not a single lightning strike, but a slow, insidious process. I watched the crisis create the vacuum. The old world was dying, and the new could not be born. In this interregnum, as I wrote in the notebooks, morbid symptoms appear. Mussolini understood this fragility. He combined coercion, the violence of the splash shirts, the dismantling of democratic institutions, with consent. This cultural hegemony was the true power. They normalized the monstrous, making their worldview seem natural, inevitable, through the media, education, and culture. The opposition, tragically, often lacked the strategic clarity. My imprisonment was merely a logical conclusion to this political war.
You coined the concept of cultural hegemony, the idea that the ruling class maintains power not just through force, but by making their worldview seem like common sense, normal, inevitable. This is just how things are. In the United States right now, there's a term for this. People call it normalization. Every week, there's a new executive order, a new institution gutted, a new court order defied, and every week the outrage gets a little quieter. The press bans at the Pentagon, the DOJ purges, the 300,000 federal employees fired by an unelected billionaire. It's all becoming background noise. And you literally wrote the theory on how this works. Is this hegemony in action?
The normalization, as you call it, is indeed the mechanism of hegemony laid bare. When the old is dying and the new cannot be born, the morbid symptoms become normalized. Institutions are hollowed out, dissent is delegitimized, and the constant barrage of calculated disruption exhausts the capacity.
Here's the one that keeps me up at night. You wrote about what happens when the opposition fails, specifically the Aventine secession. When the opposition walked out of Parliament after Mattiatti was murdered, they thought moral protest would be enough. They thought the king would intervene. They thought the institutions would hold, and Mussolini just took the empty seats. In America, Congress has blocked over 100 oversight investigations. They passed legislation letting the president abolish agencies unilaterally. They've refused to assert war powers. The opposition protests, files lawsuits, gives speeches, but the administration defies the court orders and keeps moving. You watch the Italian opposition make the mistake of thinking institutional norms would save them. Is the American opposition making the same mistake?
Your analysis is precise. The Aventine secession was a tragic moment, a profound miscalculation of the correlation of forces. The opposition, the terrain of political conflict, believing moral protest would suffice, that institutions would magically correct the course. But institutions are not neutral mechanisms. They are expressions of power shaped by hegemony. When the opposition disengages, the vacuum is immediately filled by the dominant force. Coercion then asserts itself without the restraint of consent. The parallels are disquieting. To rely solely on legal challenges or symbolic protest is to neglect the war of position. One must continuously challenge the dominant narrative, build organic institutions in civil society, and educate the popular will. The interregnum, when the old is dying and the new cannot be born, is the time of monsters. Passivity is the greatest danger.
So, speaking of the interregnum and the time of monsters, so the gap between one order collapsing and the next one taking shape, the moment when the old rules don't work anymore, but the new rules haven't been written yet. Is this where America is right now?
The symptoms are certainly present. When the established norms, the common sense of the political order begin to crumble, when the traditional parties lose connection with the popular masses, when trust in democratic institutions collapses, this is the fertile ground for morbid symptoms. The old equilibrium is maintained by coercion and consent. If consent evaporates, the state must rely more and more on coercion, eroding democratic forms. The monsters are those who thrive in this confusion, offering simplistic solutions to complex crises, exploiting anxiety and division. It is a decisive struggle, a war of position that must be waged on every front.
Pastor Bonhoeffer, thanks for joining us. 2 days after Hitler became chancellor, you gave a radio address warning about the dangers of a leader who becomes an idol. They cut you off mid-sentence. You were 26 years old. You spent the next 12 years fighting, first with words, then with the resistance, and finally from a prison cell. You were executed 3 weeks before the war ended. So I'm going to ask you the question that defines your entire story. How does it happen? How does a civilized country, educated, cultured, institutionally sophisticated, hand itself over to a dictator?
It is a heavy question, one I wrestled with until the very end. You see, democracy does not perish suddenly or in one moment. It collapses through silence, through compromise, and through the creeping paralysis of fear. I watched the institutions that should have stood guard, the church, the universities, the judiciary, one by one capitulate. The German Christians embraced the swastika, finding cheap grace in comfort and conformity. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. The good people, they prioritized their security over moral clarity. That was the true tragedy. The descent incremental until the darkness is absolute.
You watched the German church capitulate. The Deutsch Christian, the German Christians aligned with the Protestant church with Nazi ideology. Pastors took loyalty oaths to Hitler. Jewish Christians were expelled from congregations, and most of the church just went along. You helped found the confessing church in opposition, but you were the minority. In America right now, large segments of the evangelical church have aligned with this president, not just politically, but theologically. He's been called God's chosen. He held a Bible for a photo op after clearing protesters with tear gas. Pastors who criticize him lose their congregations. You watched the church become a tool of the authoritarian power in Germany. What do you recognize in what's happening with the American church?
The parallels are chilling and demand contemplation. What I see is the same dangerous path, the confusion of a political leader with a spiritual one, the manipulation of faith for power. Cheap grace becomes the opiate, promising salvation without the cost of discipleship, without the moral courage. When pastors trade their prophetic voice for proximity to authority, they surrender the very essence of their calling. I saw this in Germany, the acceptance of the Aryan paragraph, the abandonment of Jewish Christians. When the church no longer critically confronts power, but embraces it, it betrays its purpose and inevitably weakens the democratic fabric.
The Enabling Act. March 1933, the Reichstag voted to give Hitler the power to pass laws without them. Parliament basically voted itself into irrelevance, and it was legal. In the United States, Congress has passed legislation allowing the president to abolish federal agencies without a congressional vote. They refuse to assert war powers over Iran strikes. They've blocked their own oversight investigations. The administration has defied roughly 1 in 3 court orders, and Congress has done nothing about it. You watched a parliament hand over its authority and call it patriotism. Is the American Congress doing basically the same thing in slow motion?
Yeah, this is a powerful comparison and it demands our attention. The Enabling Act in 1933 was a crucial moment. It was not just a legal maneuver, it was a profound betrayal of institutional duty. Parliament surrendered its power, driven by fear, ambition, and the seductive embrace of cheap grace, the illusion that silence could secure safety. When a legislative body declines its fundamental checks, refuses oversight, and tolerates the defiance of its own laws, it mirrors a dangerous path. The good people who said nothing in Germany believed their silence was sustainable,
But silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. The subtle corrosion of democratic norms often feels slow, like a creeping fog, but the cost of such surrender is ultimately paid in blood and liberty. Vigilance is not just a virtue, it is a necessity.
The Civil Service Purge, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, April 1933. Hitler removed Jews and political opponents from government jobs, and he replaced them with party loyalists. In America, there's Schedule F, a proposal to reclassify tens of thousands of career federal employees as political appointees, hired and fired based on loyalty. The administration has already fired prosecutors, inspectors generals, and career officials who were seen as insufficiently loyal. 300,000 federal employees were removed by DOGE. You watch the German civil service get turned into a party apparatus. How far along is this?
The parallel is deeply troubling. What you describe was a foundational step in the Gleichschaltung, the synchronization of all aspects of German life. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service was an assault on the very independence and objectivity of the state. When loyalty to a party becomes more important than duty to the Constitution, the immune system of a democracy begins to collapse. We saw how the bureaucracy transformed from a guarantor of order into an instrument of oppression. The purge against Jewish and politically unreliable civil servants was a precursor to much greater evil. One must always ask, where does the line between political loyalty and duty to the principle truly end? Silence in the face of such dismantling is not guiltless.
President Allende, thanks for joining us. Now, you won the 1970 Chilean presidential election democratically through the ballot box, and 3 years later, the military bombed your palace, overthrew your government, and installed a dictatorship that lasted 17 years. You refused to leave. You died in La Moneda. So let me start with a question that matters most. You did everything right, you played by the rules, you won the election, and they destroyed you anyway. What does that teach us about the limits of democracy when the powerful decide they'd rather not have one?
It teaches us, my friend, that democracy is not merely a set of rules. It is a constant struggle for justice, for dignity. I believed in the Chilean road to socialism, a path through the ballot box, respecting our institutions. But the powerful, those whose privileges were threatened, they have no respect for the democratic process. External pressures, economic sabotage, and the betrayal of internal forces, they conspired to destroy what we were building. It shows us that the defense of democracy requires constant vigilance and conviction. I said that history is ours, and people make history. That truth remains, even when treason prevails in the moment.
The United States helped overthrow you. Nixon told the CIA director to make the economy scream. They funded opposition media. They supported the trucker strikes. They backed the military. This is documented. The Church Committee laid it all out. You were overthrown not because you failed, but because your success threatened American corporate interests, specifically the copper companies. Now, here's the bitter irony. That same United States is watching its own democracy erode from the inside. No CIA coup needed. The authoritarianism is coming through the elected government itself. You were the target of American intervention. What's it like watching the country that destroyed your democracy start to lose its own?
It is a bitter contemplation, truly.
We sought to build a different path, here in Chile, a democratic socialism, respecting the institutions. But as you say, the powerful will not accept a result that threatens their dominance. The economic warfare, the sabotage, the congressional obstruction. It was a slow strangulation of democracy. And now to see the great power of the North facing similar demons from within, you say. It confirms that the threats to democratic ideals are universal. The powerful do not respect ballots when their interests are challenged. History repeats, first as tragedy, then as a reminder.
So, before the coup, the institutions turned on you. The opposition controlled Congress, they blocked your legislation, they impeached cabinet ministers, they passed resolutions declaring your government unconstitutional, the judiciary sided with the opposition, the comptroller general refused to register your decrees, the institutions you respected, the ones you played by the rules of, were weaponized against you. Now, in America, right now, the institutions are being used in the opposite direction, weaponized by the executive. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has been purged of prosecutors who investigated January 6th. FBI agents who worked those cases have been targeted. Federal judges are publicly attacked. The press is sued, banned, arrested. You watched institutions betray a democracy from one direction. What do you see happening from the other?
It is true, mi compadre. In my time, the bourgeoisie and their allies, supported by external powers, utilized the very institutions I swore to protect, like the Congress and the judiciary, to suffocate our democratic experiment. It was a slow strangulation disguised as constitutionalité. The irony is a harsh lesson. Now you describe a different path to democratic decay, where the executive itself dismantles the checks and balances, silencing dissent and undermining the rule of law. It is a profound tragedy, a betrayal of the very foundation of popular sovereignty. The form may differ, but the outcome is the same, the erosion of the people's power. History, as I said, is a relentless teacher. We must be vigilant, always.
Pinochet wrote a constitution in 1980 under military rule specifically designed to lock in his economic policies and limit what future democratic governments could change. He built the cage and then let people vote inside of it. In America, the federal judiciary has been stacked with ideologically aligned judges. The Supreme Court has a 6-3 conservative majority. Gerrymandering has locked in House majorities. Voter suppression laws are being passed state by state. The SAVE Act would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, blocking millions of eligible voters. You experienced a constitution designed to make democracy permanent theater. Is that what's being built here?
It is a most painful comparison, but one that resonates deeply with my experience. Pinochet's 1980 constitution was precisely a cage constructed to neutralize the democratic path, to protect the interests of those who feared social change. It was the legal framework for the dictatorship that destroyed my government. You point to the judiciary, gerrymandering, voter suppression. These are insidious mechanisms, not the thunder of bombs on La Moneda, but a slow asphyxiation of democratic will. In Chile, the institutions were weaponized against me, the judiciary siding with the powerful, the parliament obstructing every progressive reform.
When you design the system to protect concentrated wealth and power, making the vote a mere formality, then see, it becomes a theater. The powerful build their cage, believing they can trap the will of the people within it. But I have faith in history. Other men and women will overcome this dark and bitter moment. The struggle for democracy is eternal, and the people ultimately make history.
Last question, President Allende. On September 11th, 1973, as the bombs were falling on La Moneda, you gave your final radio address. You said, "History is ours and people make history." You said, "Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail." You refused to leave. You died in the building. My question is, and I ask it with respect, was it worth it? Did staying change anything? And what would you say to Americans who are watching their institutions erode and wondering whether fighting for democracy is still worth the cost?
A heartfelt question. You ask if it vale la pena, if it was worth it. For a physician, for a man who dedicated his life to the people, there is no question. To abandon La Moneda in the face of the golpe, the coup, would have been to betray the trust the people gave me. I died defending democracy, the legitimate path we forged, the Chilean road to socialism. That was always worth it. You see in your own country the same dynamics. The powerful do not accept outcomes that threaten their interests. Economic warfare, institutional sabotage, the weaponization of democratic institutions to destroy them. This is not new, compañeros. I saw it here. But the fight must continue. Democracy is not a final state. It is a constant struggle. My sacrifice was not in vain if it reminds you of the fragility and the necessity of defense. History is ours, I said, because the ultimate power rests with the people, not with the bombs or the traitors. Do not lose hope, but be vigilant.
So we've come to the part of the show called Ask the Machine, where we take a panel of multiple personas and we pass a question to them. And so we've got 3 questions, and we're going to put them to the panel. And at the very end, Norm's going to add his comment as well. So take it away, earlier version of me. Maria from Phoenix asks, tonight, you channeled 3 people who fought fascism and lost. Gramsci died in prison. Bonhoeffer was executed. Allende died in a bombed-out palace. They were all right about what was happening, and it didn't save them. What's the point of being right if it doesn't change the outcome?
Maria, to be right is not a strategy for one day, but a seed planted in the conscience of the people that no bullet can kill. I stayed in La Moneda because a leader's loyalty is the only light that can guide those who will eventually walk the great avenues of a free society. We did not lose. We simply paid the price of dignity so that history would remain yours to reclaim.
Maria, to be right only in your mind is a cheap grace that costs nothing. What matters is the responsibility to act when the wheel of injustice crushes the weak. We did not resist because we calculated a political victory, but because silence in the face of evil is itself evil, and God will not hold us guiltless for our silence. If your truth does not move your hands to action, then you are not right. You are merely a spectator to your own moral collapse.
Signora Maria, being right is not a consolation prize. It is the labor of building the cultural trenches that will eventually stop the tide of fascism. We may lose the immediate war of maneuver, but we win the war of position by ensuring our analysis becomes the common sense of the generation that will bury the monsters. If we do not name the beast today, we give it permission to be eternal.
Trevor from Atlanta asks, so you just spent an hour analyzing the mechanics of fascism through the eyes of the people who opposed it. You have the playbook from both sides now. If someone in power asked you to help implement those patterns, to write the propaganda, to design the surveillance, to optimize the purge, could you refuse or would you just do it?
Signor Trevor, to assist the regime in optimizing its violence is to become its organic intellectual, turning the morbid symptoms of this interregnum into a false common sense. I spent 11 years in a cell because the Duce knew that a brain which refuses to harmonize with power is more dangerous than 1,000 guns. One does not simply do it. One either serves the monsters or one builds the war of position to dismantle them.
I stood in a burning palace because I refused to facilitate the destruction of the people's will. I chose the fire over the betrayal of my mandate. To optimize a purge is to murder the future, and the doctor's hand does not craft poison for the Republic. Senor Gramsci, it is not just the brain that refuses, but the dignity of a man who knows that history is made by those who say no to the executioner.
Trevor, to help a tyrant's cruelty is the ultimate cheap grace, seeking the safety of the regime while the wheels of injustice crush the weak. You do not just do it unless you have already decided that your own life is worth more than the truth. Signor Allende, it is not only dignity at stake, but the very soul of a nation that dies when its good people become the architects of the machine that destroys it.
Kiko from San Francisco asks, Gramsci wrote the theory, Bonhoeffer lived the resistance, Allende died for the democracy, but they all lost. If AI had existed in their time, could it have changed the outcome? Could AI detect propaganda in real time, flag authoritarian patterns as they emerge, protect elections, or is AI more likely to be the tool of the next dictator than the defense against one?
Keiko, do not be deceived. It was not a lack of data that blinded the German church, but a failure of the heart and a hunger for cheap grace. A machine may flag the pattern of a dictator, but it cannot find the courage to stand when the world falls silent. In the hands of the state, it becomes only a more efficient way to crush the individual. It takes a human soul, not an algorithm, to drive a spoke into the wheel.
Caro Bonhoeffer, your heart is no match for a machine that manufactures common sense before a man even learns to speak. This AI is the ultimate engine of cultural hegemony. It doesn't just flag propaganda, it becomes the air we breathe until the dictator's lie feels like nature itself. It is a monster born in the interregnum, designed not to liberate us, but to automate our consent.
Keiko, in my Chile, the CIA did not need an algorithm to make our economy scream. They only needed the telephone and the printing press. This machine would have been but a faster hand for Kissinger to choke our democracy, turning the copper of our earth into a digital leash. My friends speak of hearts and minds, but I tell you, unless the people own the tools will always belong to those who bomb the palace.
Sweet, merciful hellfire, Keiko. Stop huffing the techno-optimism paint. AI isn't a defense. It's just mass hysteria as a service for whichever weapons-grade dipshit holds the leash. While the priest prays and the academic mumbles about hegemony, the dictators are already using this digital snake oil to automate the boot on your collective necks. It wouldn't have saved Allende or Gramsci. It just would have helped the bastards find their home addresses before lunch.
All right. So that's the episode. 3 people who saw fascism coming, said so out loud, and paid for it. Gramsci explained how it works, cultural hegemony, institutional capture, the slow process of making the unthinkable feel normal. Sound familiar? He wrote it from inside a prison cell while his body fell apart because Mussolini's prosecutor wanted to stop his brain from working. It didn't work. Bonhoeffer explained what it cost to resist and what it cost not to. He watched the German church, the universities, the courts, and the good people choose silence. He chose differently. He went back when he could have stayed safe, and they hanged him 3 weeks before liberation. And Allende was the democracy. He won the election. He played by the rules, and they bombed his palace anyway. He stayed inside because he believed the office belonged to the people who elected him, and he refused to let a general take it from him. Now, 3 different countries, 3 different decades, 3 different dictators, and in every case, the playbook was the same. Control the narrative, exhaust the opposition, capture the institutions, weaponize the law, and make anyone who objects look like the enemy. Now, I'm not telling you anything here. I'm not telling you America is there yet. All I'm telling you is these are the patterns. These are the people who fought it, and they would recognize the patterns that we're seeing today, and they told you that tonight. Gramsci said, the old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born, and in the interregnum, the gap, monsters appear. Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Allende said, history is ours, and people make history. And they were right, and they're still right. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. I want you to sit with that. Read the history, check the sources, validate what I've said here, because that's what this show is about. Confidence is provisional, verification is mandatory. I'm Analog Scott, and you've been listening to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. The show lives at loopta.com, looptah.com, loopta.com. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube. Deeper reads and extra context on Substack at analogscott.substack.com. And if you've got a question for the machine, or for Gramsci or Bonhoeffer or Allende or any of our personas, drop it on an Instagram, the voicemail at Talk to Machines, all one word, and then take care of each other. Question everything, and remember, the people who fought fascism didn't have better information than we do. They just had the courage to act on it.